let's see here. So let's actually begin here. We're going to begin at the beginning of chapter 7, and we'll kind of just hit the first section here. And I'm going to put it up on the screen as well. So it takes 1 hit, 2 hits, 3 hits. There you go. There we go. So, chapter 7. Is that too small for people to see?
No, I can see it.
Nope.
Okay, I'm gonna make it a little bigger.
Yeah, that's better. Whoa,
There
yeah.
we go. That's better.
Now for us blind people.
Well, it's it's screens, so I'm trying to. I got to make it bigger for the confirmation kids too.
Yeah.
So, all right. So let's read this first section of chapter 7. Do you not know, brothers and sisters, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law has authority over someone by as long as the person lives. For example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive. But if her husband dies, she's released from the law that binds her to him. So that if she has sexual relations with another man while her husband is still alive, she's called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law, is not an adulteress if she marries another man. So, my brothers and sisters, you also died to the law through the body of Christ, that you might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit for God. For when we were in the realm of the flesh, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in us, so that we bore fruit for death. But now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. All right, that's that first section. What hits you here? What doesn't? What do you think? Is it all just hooey? Is it like that? That's what kind of stood out to you? Did anything?
Well, in this day and age, it's hooey.
It's hooey?
Well, look at society.
So loud.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Look at society.
Yeah, and what are you pointing out?
There is no such a thing as marriage restrictions and things like that anymore for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I knew it was very hard.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Judy.
Very hard for the people of the Catholic faith. If they got a divorce, the Catholic Church says on you. And I thought that was wrong of the Catholic Church because the people didn't disavow God. There's a lot of circumstances where you would get a divorce, and I don't think any of them are good. But it's not up to me to know. But you want to have your closeness with God, because I know they changed that law in the Catholic Church. So if you were divorced, it's not that you're excommunicated or whatever they tried to do. Because I talked to people that this happened to them years ago. So I don't know if those rules and regulations changed, but I believe someone told me they had.
They haven't changed. You'd have to get an annulment through the Catholic Church.
Right.
And if you somehow it's shown that you never had a legitimate marriage to begin with, if both parties didn't know everything, then if it was not legitimate, then you easily get an annulment. But if you just decide you want another wife, that's a little more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You agree, Pastor?
Yeah, that's as far as what I know, like the Catholic Church, that's kind of my understanding. Like I haven't, by no means, I try to be versed on what the other church bodies are doing, but I try to, I don't know everything. But yeah, that's kind of my understanding too. But so why do you think that section about marriage? So we can definitely see that there's different ideas going on there. There's different it's different than what we are what we see in our world today. So but what is he trying to say, do you think? Why is he using that example? Do you have any clue on that?
It's just kind of to set you up for the next paragraph, making it
Mhm.
something that you can kind of relate to.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
you're talking about, the husband dying, and then she's free.
Hmm.
And then in the next paragraph, we're talking about Christ dying.
Mm. Yeah,
You know?
yeah,
Which sets us free from sin, doesn't it?
Yeah.
yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we have the forgiveness.
That's a really good connection. That's a great connection to kind of following that through line through it. So he's also using all this terms of the law, is what he's talking about. Am I signed in? Yeah, I am. He's using all these terms about like the law of this, the law of that. What do you think is the law that he's talking about? What do you think's going on? There's kind of some to let you know, kind of in the realm of theological studies, there's some kind of dispute about what he's talking about. So I'm not going to say that there's like a right way of looking at this, but what do you think he's calling the law there? What do you think?
Well, I would look at it as he's talking about the old law.
The old law?
The old law, the law that the Israelites were given at the Exodus when they left Egypt.
Mount Sinai.
God in Mount Sinai, when God laid down the Ten Commandments for them.
Yeah,
Because there was very, very strict rules against adultery and that whole sex thing.
Yeah.
And now after, when Christ was born and died for us, a lot of those old quote unquote laws were tossed out.
Yeah. Tossed out is probably not how I would put it, but like
Pushed on the back burner.
Yeah. It's not a bad word. What'd you say? Someone said something.
Maybe overridden.
Yeah, overridden is good, because that's one of the things that I've really seen as I've gotten deeper into this. Like, I really got into the Old Testament. Like, I really like the Old Testament. Like, and it's like even Christ says that he is like the fulfillment of the law. So like the law is there. It's just we look at it kind of through that Jesus lens now, and look at it through that. And when I started looking at it that, there's a theologian. Oh, what's his name? I can't remember. Doesn't matter. But he's really pushed this idea that Christ has always existed, which is what we believe. That Jesus has always existed, and the best way to read theology is through the lens of Jesus. So even in the Old Testament, we look at all of that through the lens of Jesus, because when we're looking at it through the lens of Jesus, we're looking at it through the heart of God. And that kind of adjusted my perspective on reading the Old Testament, because it just, I used to really fall underneath that. That's like, oh, this God of the Old Testament is so wrathful and vengeful and nasty. And I don't see that anymore. I don't see that, because I think I had to rewire my brain to see Jesus in the Old Testament. And then you're like, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. So that's, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
You talk about God being nasty and revengeful.
Mm-hmm.
In every case, it was well earned by the people.
What do you mean, well earned?
Well, earned.
They did something wrong.
They
Oh,
were
yeah, okay, yeah,
doing
okay.
something, the golden calf, etc.
I didn't know if you meant the
God just didn't strike out because he had a bad morning.
Yeah.
The people deserved what they got,
Yeah.
I think.
And oftentimes, and see, this is, some people disagree with me on this. A lot of times, the people wanted it. So like that's really how I view the exile, like when Babylon comes and takes over the Israelites and all those things. We see from the time they left Egypt all the way up until they're taken over is that we have to see all these warnings of like don't be like don't pine after Egypt, don't go after Egyptian horses, don't go after all these things. And what we see Egypt is just a Babylon. It's just our power, power and prestige and all those things, and they want to be that. And you look at Solomon and all the kings that followed Solomon, they wanted the power and prestige of the nations around them.
Mhm.
Israelites even yelled out like, "Hey, we want a king like the other nations," and I kind of think the exile and the captivity was kind of God's hand saying, "Well, if you want that so bad, here you go.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas." Like that's and that's that's looking at it that way has really made me come up with a theology of be careful what you wish for.
Right.
Right.
Like that's be careful, because like sometimes we actually get what we want, and I think that's kind of what Paul is getting at when in other places, and we'll get to it in Romans, we're not there yet, but when he starts talking about being content, where many times we're like, we need to handle this, they're taking us over and all that stuff. And sometimes we get what we want, and it ends up not being what we thought it was going to be. And so I think getting us back to actually this lesson. So he sets up that idea of that the lady is freed from the law because of a death. And I think Melinda, when you said that connects with Jesus' death, I think that's really astute there. But what's interesting is what Paul is doing is he's saying we put so much weight on this law, right? But if there's a death, so he just has this example, which is really common. It's also, what's interesting is that Jesus also references that same set of laws in there. And he's talking about how people are taking advantage of it. Like and so you could tell that just like today, that people take advantage of, they're looking for the edges of where they can get away with something, right? And they
Taxes.
yeah, and they take advantage of it, and we see that's probably what Paul's referencing. So Paul's always being a little cheeky. That's all right. Here's Chris Escher studying the Bible 201. Most of the Bible is a little cheeky. Does that make sense when I say that? Like it's a little, like there's a whole lot of stuff that's kind of tongue in cheek, because a lot of the Bible is written in times where there was persecution. Persecution is not the right word. Where if you need to talk about the truth about what's going on, you got to put your tongue in your cheek as you say it, right? Like you can't talk smack about King Solomon when he's the king, right? You can't talk smack about the Roman government and about how they are the new Babylon and how they are taking over everything. So you have to put your tongue in your cheek and talk about it. That's how John wrote Revelation. Okay? Like when you look at all the scary stuff in Revelation, it's all Roman imagery. And so but if he just spoke plainly, Rome would just come in, grab all those documents and throw them away. But they didn't want to take time and actually read them. So it's all tongue in cheek. So when you read stuff like that, because we talk in the same way, we use weird words constantly to be kind of funny and to say double meanings, you know. We do that all the time, so that when we're talking to people, they know what we're doing. So I have a feeling that this was an abused law that was always just known that it was abused, like how divorce happens and, you know, and the moving around. So Paul's kind of referencing that, and people are like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. But then you add the other element of that. Who is he writing to? Is he writing to Jews? Like, no, right? Like he's writing to the Romans. There's probably like a Jewish sect inside of Rome, but it's probably a primarily Gentile church there in Rome. And so he's probably also referencing just a overarching law that's like, it's even a law in our own hearts that when we know that there's a death in a family, no one really minds what happens after that. So and then as Melinda said, you know, that then he connects it with Jesus. So what I think he's saying here is he's like, we put so much faith in this law, but if there's a death in there, then it doesn't really matter. You see, kind of, it's almost like he's eroding faith in it a little bit, which is interesting. It's an interesting kind of tactic. I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on any of that?
Well, I also kind of think that talking about the law is so hard to live up to the law.
Yeah.
We can't.
Yeah.
We're all sinners.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we can't. So,
Yeah.
you know, so through Christ, it's not that we don't have to pay any attention to the law, but because we can't possibly uphold that law,
Mm-hmm.
we're saved through Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very true. Like that's great. That's great. Let's see. Let me get back to my screen here.
Very well put.
Yeah. Let's see. There we go. So and I think, you know, the verse that we've been talking about is, so my brothers and sisters, you also died to the law through the body of Christ, that you might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit for God. This is one of my big things, and honestly, this is something in the last 3 years. So something I've really picked up while I've been at Grace, is that this idea right here, that we've been raised from the dead in order that we might bear fruit for God. This fruitful argument is like temple language. It's so the temple. So remember the Garden of Eden and the fruitfulness of the garden and all those things. And and the Garden of Eden is really like, when you look at the Bible and the lore that's really presented there. I'll stop the share again. That it's this connection between, it's the place where God's space and our space overlapped, and it was a place of fruitfulness and of grace and peace and all that stuff, but fruitfulness is really there. So what's interesting is when there were plans laid out for like the tabernacle and then the temple later on, there's all these reliefs and statues of fruit trees all over the temple and tabernacle that are made there. And what that's showing you is that the temple is the place where God is meeting humanity again. That's kind of the hot spot of God's presence. And in the hot spot of God's presence, it's viewed as the Garden of Eden. So the hot spots of God's presence creates fruitfulness. So when you then think about Paul later on in like Galatians and doing the fruits of the Spirit, he's not just saying like this clever metaphor about like fruits of the Spirit. He's mentioning like this is what the heavenly realms look like. And the heavenly realms come through you, through the arbiter of the heavenly realms, the Spirit. And so creates fruitfulness in you, creates the Garden of Eden through you. See that? And so Paul is referencing that, which is really cool, which I think is really cool. It's that he's now going back and he's using temple imagery to start talking about bearing the fruit of God. So verse 5 here, for when we were in the realm of the flesh, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in us, so that we bore fruit for death. All right, you see what he's doing? Yeah, bear fruit for God and then fruit for death. All right, come on. But now, by dying to once that which has bound us, we have been raised from the law so that we serve a new way of the Spirit, and not only in the old way of the written code. I don't know, does anyone have any thoughts?
Well, what does he mean by the new way of the Spirit?
Ooh, that's like that's such a good question, because this is like so many different denominations mean all these different things off of this stuff. I don't know. Do you have any thinking about it? Like, how does it hit you? Like the new way of the Spirit. Do you have any ideas about what it may be?
No,
Well-
I really don't.
Okay.
Well, to use verse 6, we were dying, what once bound us to sin. We've been released from the law by Christ's death
Mm-hmm.
and the Holy Spirit that is within us,
Yeah.
and not the old way of the written code, which all of us were damned to damnation.
Yeah. Which is kind of what you were talking about a little bit there earlier. So I think what he's setting up, and we're gonna get into this here in a little bit if we got time. But he is. So he's setting up a few things. So he set up the fruitfulness. He set up how death can free us from the law. And death can free us from the law. There's already precedent for that we see in marriages. And so death can free us from the law. And then he also sets up this idea of bearing fruit for death. Now, this was another thing that I realized, which was really big, is death is the problem. That death's the problem. You know, when Genesis chapter 3, when the curse was all come onto it, death was the problem there. And so we have life versus death, fruitfulness versus unfruitfulness. Whereas Paul's putting it now, we got fruit for God or fruit for life, and then fruit for death. Here's what I think is also interesting is the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in us. What do you think he's trying to say there? This is a weird statement. And Judy, I haven't forgotten about your question either. We're getting there. So what do you think he's talking? Like sinful passions aroused by the law within us. What do you think he's talking about?
I think of the idea of when someone says the word forbidden, all of a sudden it's tempting.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
And they, you know, it's hard for them to not want to go there because it's like being a teenager. When your parents tell you not to, you fight even harder to do it.
Yeah.
But can I say something about Judy's question about the new spirit? What, to me, that's because you're in the New Testament, it's the infusion of Jesus into that thought.
Mhm.
oh, that sounds lovely. I like that, Cheryl. That was
Yeah,
good.
the infusion of, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That's a good way of
A
putting it.
lot.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Let's see here. I was looking in a different translation to see if it was meaningfully worded a different way, because we're looking at the NIV. I like the NIV translation. The ESV is clunky to read to me, and so, all right, it's not meaningfully different. So let's get into. Let me share again. So that we bear fruit for death, but now by dying to once bound us. So now Jesus dying to once bound us, we have been released from the law so that we serve in a new way of the Spirit. Let me see if the ESV words that a different way. It's not meaningfully different. And so he so that we serve in a new way of the Spirit. So what I think he's talking about there, Judy, is like what Cheryl said, and in the infusion of Jesus. But I think he's saying that many times we're aroused by like, ooh, like, I'm not allowed to do this now. We see that that's exactly what Paul thinks later on in the reading. But he goes, oh yeah, I like the law has revealed to me this new thing of nastiness that I could do, that we actually bear fruit of death. But since now we have a death and a resurrection on our side, that we have been released from the captivity of that thing which held us down, which he's calling the law. And now we can serve in a new way of the Spirit. Right now, he's getting us ready what's going to happen in the next chapter, chapter 8. Okay? So be ready for that down the road. But we've been released from the law is to serve in a new way of the Spirit, to serve in that the counselor, the one that God sent to us all, the Holy Spirit. It is Pentecost this weekend, right?
Right, right,
Everything
okay.
is red up there.
Yeah,
And
Sunday.
so it's that the counselor has come, the advocate has come, and he works within us to serve in this new way, where it's not about. I think he's what he's trying to say. It's not about the nitpicking and trying to find the loopholes, but it's rather living in a code of trying to find life, trying to bear the fruit for God rather than the fruits of death. And so I think he's turning it around to where the outlook is now positive rather than negative. Where it's like, oh, I gotta keep God on my good side, like gotta what's all this? And now he's saying, listen, we've already had a death. Jesus died and rose again for us. It's not about getting God on our good sides. It's now living in a way that brings life into the creation, much like God did when he spoke into it. And in fact, the way God spoke into it by the Spirit, by the wind coming out of his mouth, that pneuma, that Spirit, that is now the way we live, and we bring life into it by God's Spirit. And I think that's kind of the new way. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's I think that is kind of what he's kind of talking about there. So let's see here. Let's kind of just read this section really quick here. All right, you need to understand this. Chapter 7 of Romans is incredibly complex and weird. And so just understand that, because it's just odd. So let me read this real quick. So what shall we say then? Is the law sinful? So he's just spent time eroding the law, right? He's like, is it actually bad? It's like, no, it's not bad. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So he's recognizing that, okay, no, it's good about saying the things that we do are bad, but sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. This is super weird stuff. Apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. I don't really know what he's talking about here.
Like you said, weird.
It's weird. I think it goes back to what we said earlier, what Cheryl said earlier, that when someone puts a sign up that says "Don't do this," it kind of arouses in us to do it. I think he's talking about that, but it's still odd. It's a still odd thing to say. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. There's a couple things we're going on here. We got to remember who Paul was as well. So when he's talking about the law, who was he before all of this? You guys remember? Who was Paul?
He was a persecutor, a killer.
Yeah, he's a persecutor. And why was he persecuting and killing?
Because he believed in the law. Everybody's
He
got to do about the
believed in the law.
law.
He believed in the law above everything else.
Right. That was his judging tool.
Yeah. Yeah, John?
Was he a Pharisee? What? I mean,
Yeah, he's a Pharisee. He even describes himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. Like he's like the man,
The super.
Yeah. Like he was a Pharisee. And in order to serve God best, he had to bring the law to all these people. And by bringing the law to all these Christians, he was bringing about literal fruitfulness of death. Is that like listen, in the last year, that's something that I have seen this in the last year that I have grown theologically there, that when we are just constantly making sure that, oh, you got to be correct, or like you're getting in arguments on Facebook, or your kids say something unfortunate and you got to correct them or something like that. And that I think we got to be careful that we're not bringing that law of death, that we may be correct, but how we're using our correctness isn't the best. I mean, does that make sense? And that's, I see that a lot. I think that sometimes is what separates good pastors from bad pastors, is that some guys are just like, it's my way or the highway.
Oh, yes.
Mhm.
I know a pastor like that, and he's not you.
Yeah.
He's my nephew.
He's your nephew. He's got
Yes,
to be his way or the highway.
that's right.
Yeah, like that's, and I think that's something that it's super tempting, because it's like, ooh, I got the law on my side.
Yeah.
And
I used to say you can be, when you're driving, he'd say you can be right, but you can be dead right.
Ah,
yeah, like
Remember that.
and the other thing like that I really like saw is like, so if we're constantly harping on the law and like who's doing it correctly and who's not, we'll do that. As soon as we take care of this person, then we'll just move on to the next person. And we'll do that and do that and do that until we're alone.
We all got the thunder, huh?
Storms are coming.
Yeah, it's raining here. And so. it's-
I'm gonna have to leave. I'll
Okay,
tell you
well,
what, I'm getting weary.
you're getting weary. Listen, I don't flaunt your failures, Judy. All right?
Sure you do.
But it's good seeing you guys. But no, I think to wrap up here, because we're kind of at the edge of it anyway. To wrap up here is that Paul, it kind of looks like he's eroding the law, but he's actually not. He's bringing the fullness of how Jesus brings in the fullness of the law, but he's switching it from a thing that says, oh, we got to find the cracks in it, to where we can find the fullness of life that is coming from the Spirit in it. And I think that's what he's kind of pushing us into. And so I think that's kind of interesting. I think it's kind of interesting.